Washington Journal continues.
Our topic, threats to the homeland, and our guest is Seth Jones. He is Policy Director for International Security and Defense Issues at the RAND Corporation here in Washington, D.C. I want to begin with what the President said Friday at the White House.
As we have witnessed recently, America faces grave threats. Terrorists have struck in the streets and subways of New York City twice in a few months. Both terrorists came to our country through the dysfunctional immigration system that we are correcting, and rapidly. And one came through chain migration. The other, visa lottery. They have a lottery. You pick people. Do you think the country's given us their best people? No. What kind of a system is that? They come in by a lottery. They give us their worst people. They put them in a bin. But in his hand, when he's picking them, is really the worst of the worst. Congratulations, you're going to the United States. Okay. What a system, lottery system. We're calling for Congress to end chain migration and to end the visa lottery system and replace it with a merit-based system of immigration.
The President on Friday, Seth Jones, your reaction to what he said?
Well, I think it's important to look at the actual facts. There have been, since 9/11, 86 plots involving jihadist groups, Salafi jihadist groups against the U.S. homeland. Of those 86 plots, more than half were from U.S. citizens. And of the remaining, most were actually legal, naturalized U.S. citizens. A smaller, very small number were refugees or immigrants. So, I mean, I think the reality is we've got a problem of Americans in the United States who have been inspired to conduct attacks. Keeping a close eye on who we let into the country may help to some degree with a small minority of the threats we face. But the vast majority of threats are coming from inside our borders, not outside.
This is the headline from the Staten Island newspaper, rejecting the new normal after the latest terror attack, what we saw in New York City near Times Square. Apparently a lone wolf came to the U.S. from Bangladesh, and it was a homemade bomb. That, you say, is the bigger threat?
Well,
I mean, he lived in America.
Yeah, I mean, again, the most of the if you look at the last 10 years, the most serious plots we've had, the ones that have been most likely to kill individuals, are people who were born here. This is Najib al-Azazi in New York City, Faisal Shahzad, also a New York City attack. The ones so those are people really capable of building major bombs and killing large numbers of people. The guy Al-Qaeda Ullah that was involved in the recently in the Manhattan plot. I mean, this was like an amateur. This is not a serious plot per se. Certainly concerning that he built a pipe bomb together, but this is an amateur. This is not a real serious grade A terrorist. Most of those have been Americans.
We are now in the holiday season, many Americans traveling, and renewed threats, especially in major targets like New York City, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Los Angeles. What would you advise the Department of Homeland Security? What are they looking out for now?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to recognize that the terrorism threat persists throughout the years. It's not just about a holiday season or major dates like July 4th or the anniversary of 9/11. They can strike at any time. What I would encourage people to keep an eye out on is if there are large crowds gathering. One of the weakest vulnerabilities with the European-style attacks we've seen in Paris or in Germany or in recently in Spain as well, is large crowds gathering with no barriers. So with individuals that attempt to take a vehicle like a truck and drive it into people, it's easy. It's relatively easy to do. Got to make sure there are barriers. That's for parades and things like that, because we've seen a major increase in the number of those kinds of vehicle attacks, which I think is relatively easily preventable if you have barriers that make it difficult. So, I mean, things like that, tactics like that, I think are important to keep an eye on where terrorists are going.
One step further, what is the difference between ISIS coordination and ISIS inspiration?
Well, what an ISIS coordinated or directed attack looks like is what we saw in 2015 in Paris. These people were trained in Syria and Iraq. The plot itself emanated from senior leaders in those areas. They train specifically for this type of attack. Think of it the way maybe law enforcement would work on security in at a major event. They've walked through it. They've practiced it in many ways. So you're using trained people. You've walked through it. You've collected intelligence for it, and then you're executing it. Much higher probabilities that it succeeds. Much higher probability that it kills large numbers of people. An inspired attack means somebody got an idea sitting in their living room in whatever city, has to scramble onto the television or on the internet to figure out how to do this. Much lower probability that they'll actually execute, and certainly lower probability that they'll kill anybody.
One final point before we get to calls. We're talking with Seth Jones of the Rand Corporation. The president made reference to that Visa lottery program. Are there holes in the system?
Well, I think there are always holes that are worth taking a closer look at, including just the system itself, the vetting that's going on, looking carefully, particularly at where people are coming from and whether groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda are trying to push people through the system. Libya has certainly been a concern. There's been an increase in the number of ISIS attempted people to come from Libya into Europe. So certainly areas where you can look at and improve.
Our phone lines are open at 202-748-8000 for Democrats and 202-748-8001 for Republicans. We have a line for independents. We'll also take your tweets at C-SPAN WJ. What is the difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or is there a difference?
Well, there's a difference in a couple of ways. First of all, they originated roughly out of the same ideology. In fact, ISIS broke away in 2014 from Al-Qaeda. So they come from a very similar ideology. Their goals collectively are to establish an emirate, a radical Islamic emirate that goes from North Africa and Southern Europe all the way to the Asia-Pacific region. Where they differ is obviously its leadership structure. So Al-Qaeda is led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, ISIS is led by Abu Dua or Baghdadi. They have a difference in a couple other areas. ISIS has been a lot more prone to killing Shia and to these violent beheadings that we've seen in Iraq and Syria. So some differences in the brutality of tactics that in the brutality Al-Qaeda has tried to shy away from the really serious brutality that ISIS has done.
Seth Jones is with the Rand Corporation, serving as a policy director focusing on international security and defense areas, a graduate of Boyden College and the University of Chicago. He's an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. And George is joining us from Ocala, Florida. Republican line, good morning.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. And I have to say that I think the Rand Corporation is a great American institution by now, aside from being a great company. I wish I had stock in it. I don't even want to look at the price. But I wanted to say that I also hope that we build our military. Let me ask you something. My father was a shell shocker for the Second World War. From the Battle of Operation Cobra, it was called. It was the Battle of St. Lo. You can't hardly even find any information on it, even if you Google it. I got to tell you, it was the biggest event of friendly fire in history, man, 2 days in a row. Take a look at that, please. I wanted to ask some of the guys out there listening if anybody knows about it, but it is really an interesting subject. That's enough for me. Thank you very much for allowing me to voice my opinion, and good day.
George from Ocala, Florida, thank you.
Thanks, George. And Ocala is beautiful horse country, so great area. I mean, let me just jump on a point about the military. I don't know as much about the specific event George is referring to, but one of the things I want to highlight off the military is how important I think it is for the United States to continue to deal with some of these terrorists overseas. And I think if you look at some of the changes in the past year at how terrorists have operated, how the U.S. has operated against them, George, I would highlight the U.S. strategy in Syria and Iraq, which has decreased the Islamic State's footprint and control of territory. U.S. military predominantly worked by, with, and through local forces, Iraqi forces in the Iraq context, Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, in the Syrian context. So what it's meant is the U.S. is leveraging locals as opposed to putting its own forces, for the most part, on the front lines in countries where locals should be standing up and fighting for their liberties. And it's actually been successful, relatively successful. ISIS has lost virtually all the territory it controlled in 2014 in both Iraq and Syria. So I think kudos to the strategy right now for at least severely weakening ISIS. This threat is not over from these kinds of groups, but I think the military's role in it is important. Obviously, it's important for development and diplomatic organizations and intelligence ones as well. But George hits on an important military point.
From Baltimore, Maryland, Independent Line, Tony, good morning.
Good morning. Terrorism. We have terrorism here in this country, where in Las Vegas we had many Americans killed. In the Carolinas, that gentleman that walked into a black church and shot down all these people. We kill more people ourselves than any Islamic terrorist kill.
Tony, two points. One is when it comes to the definition of terrorism, what most people who work on terrorism, both inside the U.S. government and outside, generally focus on is the targeting of civilians with a political motivation. So there has to be some broader political motivation. Individuals that are killing because they're upset about a job, or upset because they're mentally deranged or insane, generally would not be coded as terrorism per se. But I think the broader point is true, is we certainly have a problem in the United States with violence in the U.S., in places like schools, in places like Las Vegas, in addition to attacks and plots coming from overseas, or Americans inspired by groups operating overseas. I would not, though, downplay the threat coming from jihadist groups. Remember, since 9/11, there have been a large number of people killed both in the U.S. and outside, and there continue to be plots. Again, 86 plots since 9/11, 22 actual attacks. So, there is a threat. One can debate how much, but there is a threat.
This program is carried on Sirius XM, the POTUS channel 124 every Sunday morning, so we welcome our listeners there. Of course, also every day on C-SPAN Radio, streamed on the web at cspan.org. And our guest is Seth Jones of the RAND Corporation. We're focusing on threats to the homeland, in particular what happened in New York last week and the ongoing threats across the country. Is Africa a breeding ground for many of these potential terrorists?
Well, Steve, I think Africa has become, over the last couple of years, an area of much more serious concern when it comes to terrorism. And it's really the use of several locations as hotbeds for recruitment and training. There's West Africa, which is Nigeria. That group is Boko Haram. That organization has been involved in a number of attacks, mostly in that region. When you look up north, probably the most serious concerns are up in North Africa and countries like Libya. There is a major sanctuary for a number of jihadist groups, including the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in Libya. The Europeans have been very concerned because of the proximity to Europe. It's sits on the Mediterranean, and it's been there have been multiple attempts to get people from Libya and North Africa, Tunisia, Egypt into Europe. And the third region is the Horn of Africa, or East Africa, and that's Somalia, then across that into Yemen. Those three areas we've seen individuals both from those countries themselves and foreigners coming to train and to target outside. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula from Yemen, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and a range of groups operating in Libya continue to attract some number of foreigners who some fight, some may return to the West to conduct attacks. So Africa has definitely been, there's been an uptick in individuals in Africa that I think pose a threat.
From New York City, Mike, you are next. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call, and I very much like the conversations that we're having this morning. Was in New York for the 93 attack. I was in New York for the 9/11 attack. I live in Manhattan. I think, unfortunately, our society, as we've done with the opioid crisis, we're much more reactionary than we are preventative. And when we become preventative, I think as a society, we start calling people phobic, Islamophobic, and all that. And if you look at Europe, I think a large number of those attacks are people who have been in those communities for 10, 20, 30 years and have been being taught these things. So, again, it's not an Islamophobic statement, but I think, in my opinion, and I'd like to get Mr. Jones' opinion, not to put him on the spot, but do we need to look at what people are being taught inside of their communities and what's going on outside of certain mosques? And again, I'm not making a blanket statement, but it needs to be from within the cure, not America or other people. So thank you for taking time. Thank you.
Mike, thanks for adding your voice to the conversation. We'll get a response.
Mike, thanks for your question. Let me start with Europe, and then I'll come to the U.S. I mean, what we've seen in Europe, not only is its proximity to Iraq and Syria, and the ability to go by boat or by land border from that area through Turkey into Europe, so it's closer. But we've also seen in countries like France a big division between much of French society and some of the poor areas on the outskirts, let's say, of Paris. And in those areas, there has been a pretty significant radicalization process. It's part religious, it's part social, it's part economic, and it's also partly in the prison system. So that has contributed to what is a much higher number of deaths due to terrorism than in the United States. Actually, strikingly number, almost 4 times the number of individuals killed in Europe as there have been in the U.S. I think when you come back to the U.S. and you make some interesting points, I think the challenge with talking about the physical aspect of radicalization in the U.S. is we also have the online aspect of radicalization, and both the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are doing this. They're trying to radicalize people online, inspire them, as well as in the prison systems. So I certainly think one has to look at individuals in the communities, in the range of communities, in cities like New York, in cities like Washington and Los Angeles and Chicago, in the outskirts, because some of the plots are happening outside of those areas. But I also think it's worth noting that some of this radicalization is happening online, and it's also happening when people get sent to prison. We've seen some individuals radicalized in the prison system. So I think what I would come back to is there is definitely a struggle, one might even call it a war of ideas that is going on. I think right now, based on what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria and Libya and others, the support levels for the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda have come down somewhat. So they're losing right now in terms of support, their support base. And I think that's an important fact to remember. But I also think that the struggle will go on in the living rooms or kitchens of the United States, in prisons, and certainly online for the foreseeable future.
Our guest is the director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation. You can follow him on Twitter at Seth G. Jones. Jim from Marietta, Ohio. Good morning, Independent Line.
Good morning. I wanted to ask Mr. Jones exactly how much money does the RAND Corporation make off of war? Because he seems to be putting out a narrative there to get us all scared into a war. So I'm thinking, wow, he's put out the perfect narrative to try to get America to go to war. But you know what? Americans are tired of war. Americans don't believe in war. When we supposedly got Saddam Hussein, we killed him. We didn't bring him back to America to identify him or autopsy him. We pitched him off the edge of a boat. Well, then I think all of a sudden, gee, we really didn't get him. Gee, we really didn't kill him. Okay, then Muammar Gaddafi gets killed. They parade him around on the front of a Jeep. Americans just don't trust their government.
Jim, two quick points. One is I would certainly urge you to look at RAND's website. Much of RAND's research and analysis is actually on topics like education, healthcare, population, so it has nothing even to do with national security, let alone war. So certainly urge you to take a look at the research coming out of it, and you'll actually see a significant chunk comes from a lot of non-national security related issues. But on the subject of war, I just want to be very clear about this. The argument is not that war is a good thing. I've spent time overseas as a civilian in United States Special Operation. I've seen it up close. It's a terrible thing. The argument is that we have a threat coming both inside the country and outside from a small number of terrorist organizations. And I think the issue is, how do you handle it? Well, you handle it multiple ways. You handle it with local law enforcement agencies and local communities inside the U.S., organizations like the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, joint terrorism task forces that bring all that together. Overseas, you handle it by diplomats who are working to identify and support other countries as they struggle against terrorist organizations. It's handled by U.S. development agencies that try to identify some of the grievances that are causing this, and with militaries. And I think I would just point out that the U.S. has gone away from, and frankly, in my view, should go away from, deploying large numbers of American forces overseas to fight against these kinds of organizations and support states, countries like Iraq and others, to do it themselves. So it's not us doing it for them, it's the U.S. helping them do it. And it's really protecting U.S. citizens, which is critical. But I would also highlight that, that it's important to note that the U.S. has plenty of other challenges. North Korea overseas, economic issues, Russian, a rising China. It's got plenty of issues at home. None of this means that the U.S. shouldn't be focusing on these other issues, which it should. We're just talking here about the terrorism problem.
The website, by the way, is rand.org, and this is what it looks like. You can also go inside and focus on a couple of different issues if you're interested, including the burdens of Brexit, and to our topic this morning, ISIS could rise again. We'll go to Yasser, who's joining us from Shepherdsville, Kentucky. Good morning, Republican Line.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. We are ignoring one group that was most effective against ISIL and Daesh, which are the Kurds in Kirkuk. And with small weapons, they managed to eradicate them. But we did not support them enough. They're asking for help. And
we'll get a response. Thank you, Yasser.
Yasser, yeah, I think you make an important identification to talk about the Kurds. Kurds have been important in a number of respects. One is they have been the bulk of the force that the U.S. and its allies have worked with in Syria that have composed the Syrian Democratic Forces. This is to take over to take back the Daesh, as you use, or Islamic State held areas of Raqqa and along the Euphrates River. Kurds have been important in northern and other parts of Iraq, including taking back parts of Mosul, and territory held by ISIS in northern and some other areas of Iraq. So the Kurds have been critical. The challenge with the Kurds, obviously, has been a political one, which is the Kurds have been important fighters against these kinds of groups. The challenge is there are elements of the Kurds that have been pushing for independence. There are Kurds in Syria and Kurds in Iraq and Kurds in Turkey, and then Kurds in other areas of the Middle East. How to deal with an emboldened Kurdish population, I think, is a very politically sensitive issue for all the governments in the Middle East. So you have this effort to support different Kurdish forces, YPG, SDF, in countries like Syria. And then you also have some of the broader ambitions of a Kurdish independent state that I think are connected but are much more sensitive to countries in the region. I think that's what makes the Kurdish issue a very complicated one. I think one that is going to take some time to work through with governments in the region is how do you continue to support Kurdish forces that have been effective on the ground, but also deal sensitively to broader political issues, especially as Kurds want more autonomy, and then some certainly want a broader independent state.
For Seth Jones of the Rand Corporation, Russell is next in South Carolina, Democrats line. Good Sunday morning. Thank you for waiting.
Yes, good morning. My comment is that the President of the United States, and I am a Christian, and I am also an Air Force veteran, but the President of the United States seemed to be festering terrorism by declaring Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Four Palestinians died yesterday. We mentioned the New York bomber, but we don't mention the fact that he said he did it because people were dying in Palestine because of the president's decision.
Your response?
Yeah, Russell, the issue of Jerusalem is obviously it's a very complex and hot button issue. I would say this, that it's possible, and I think there have been a number of concerns that the political decision to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem may create anger and potentially trigger violence, either directed at the U.S. or the Israelis or others from that move and from broader issues. But I would also point out that a lot of the terrorism we're seeing, and we've seen in the last decade and a half, is coming from other issues as well. It's individuals that are that want to support an emirate, an Islamic emirate, an extreme Islamic emirate that comes from Africa through the Middle East into South Asia and into the Pacific, regardless of what we see and the issue of Jerusalem. And they're inspired by individuals like Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, Abu Dua, the head of the Islamic State. So I would say there are a lot of issues that may be inspiring individuals to conduct terrorism. What you're putting your finger on is one, but I would still say it's not been a driving factor in the terrorism we've seen over the past few decades that is tied to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Time for one more call. Leo's joining us out west in San Diego, Independent Line. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. I guess what's happening over there is happening over here, and I don't like what I'm seeing, to be honest with you. I'm an independent, and I took that to the highest degree. I've never voted for a president. When I graduated high school, I got my notice, and I had to go sign up, which I did, and I served my time. But ever since then, and that was the toughest part of my life, I had to live through the Johnson years. Now I see the Johnson years reflecting in the Obama years. And that being said, Mr. Obama openly supported the Islamic threat and the care. And it upsets me a great deal that all these people have come to the United States. They have filled their mosque with radicals. And look at the evidence that proves this to be a fact. Is there any way that immigration can be formed and reformed in such a way that we make sure that anybody with any kind of radical instincts can be kept out of the country? And God bless everybody and happy holidays. Thank you very much.
Leo, thank you. And we conclude where we began.
Thanks, Leo, for your question. Again, I think there is a concern, a threat from extremist groups operating in the United States. Obviously, it's not just Islamic extremist groups. We've had, over the last few decades, extremist left-wing, extremist right-wing, ethnic nationalist organization. But on the extremist Islamic threat, inspired or connected to groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, or ISIS or Daesh. Again, I think the immigration problem, in my view, the data does not support that the vast majority of individuals opposed to the threat are immigrants. The vast majority are Americans and have been Americans here in the United States. They may be, and I think this gets to the challenge we face, they may be inspired by ideologies coming from overseas. So I think fixing some of the immigration challenges will help to some degree, but it doesn't deal with a vast majority of plotters that are living in the United States, have been in the United States, are U.S. citizens, and have grown up in the United States. And the challenge in the society we face, again, is that we've got an ability through social media and through the internet to get access to ideas coming from overseas. And where I'd end this is by saying that I think I've seen some progress in American companies, like with Google or on platforms like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, that they've become a lot more sensitive towards trying to take down sites that are actually inspiring violence, much like you treat child pornography. There's obviously a sensitive civil liberties issue as well, but I think there's been a recognition that there are problems in radicalizing individuals from the U.S., and I actually think that's where where a big part of the focus is the ideas coming from overseas that are inspiring some Americans to do it, not just the immigration issue.
Very quickly, with a half-minute left, though, is that your biggest concern, your biggest worry, your biggest fear?
I think my biggest worry is the ability of some of these groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to inspire individuals online. And as actually we saw with the Al-Qaeda plot, what was interesting is his bomb was made entirely or almost entirely from downloading and searching on the internet. The pipe bombs, a 9-volt battery, the Christmas lights that he used were entirely motivated by what he was finding on the internet. So it's the inspiration and actually how to build a bomb were critical in that plot.
Seth Jones of the RAND Corporation, thank you very much for being with us. Happy holidays.
Thank you very much.
I want to share with you this headline from the Arkansas Democrat and Gazette, all focused on the tax bill. It will be on the House floor Tuesday. We'll have full coverage here on C-SPAN, then on to the Senate, and then, assuming it passes, it will head to the president for his signature. This headline, President Trump lauds the tax bill as a middle-class boon.